So I think we're live now. So welcome everyone to this session on global and regional data governance and digital trade. I'm Iain Sandford. I'm a partner at Sidley, Austin and Geneva. It's my pleasure to moderate today's session. As a practitioner, one always takes the stage at an academic conference like SIEL with humility. That's particularly the case for me today because this is a challenging topic. Evidently, the issues are very important, but they're also very complex. And my sense from reading the papers prepared by today's panelists is that the rules that govern digital trade are constantly trying to catch up with the ever-evolving features of digital trade. So against that background, we're lucky to have four impressive thinkers guiding us through the issues today. Let me introduce our panel. Neha Mishra is a lecturer at the Australian National University in Canberra. Neha has called for a multi-pronged approach to trade and data governance. Franziska is an associate professor at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. She asks what role for African digital trade law as it relates to digital inclusion, development, and trade policy. Rodrigo Polanco is legal advisor at the Swiss Institute of Comparative Law and a senior lecturer and researcher at the World Trade Institute in Bern. Rodrigo has explored digital trade provisions in existing trade agreements. And finally, Rolf H. Weber is a professor at the University of Zurich and a consultant at Bracci Attorneys. Rolf asks, are international trade law rules suitable for digital assets? Colleagues, thank you very much for letting me join your discussion. Okay, let's begin. This session builds on published research and analysis from each of the speakers. So to lay our scene, I'll invite each speaker to give us a quick rundown on their analysis. We'll then chat about some of the contemporary issues in data governance and digital trade. We'd love you, the audience, to be part of that discussion, so please drop questions into the public chat box and I'll try and work them into the discussion. To help keep on top of where things are at in the discussion and when you might like to ask your questions, I've listed the basic themes in the public chat. Okay, enough from me. Let's turn things over to our speakers to introduce their research. Rolf, if you could go first, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you very much, Iain. The digitalization is transforming the trade in goods and services. That's not a new assessment. On the one hand, often not the physical good as such, but its contents is of importance, for example, software on a hard disk. On the other, the physical good often can be replaced by a digital service without any qualitative deterioration. For example, in case of downstreaming a film from the internet. The ongoing discussions have become even more complicated, however, with the advent of a new technology, namely the blockchain or distributed ledger technology. The traded goods in form of digital assets are intangibly circulating. The respective values are often called tokens, being special containers for data that represent the traded goods. The classification systems of both the GATT with the harmonized system, the HS code, and the GATTs with the services sectoral classification list do not provide any good guidance on how to classify digital assets. In particular, the borderline between a good and a service is blurring and could eventually even disappear. Furthermore, goods are often inextricably interlinked with services, as the example of the Internet of Things shows. And in addition, know-how and data have become very valuable components of cross-border trade. Did the WTO react to these developments? A cautious answer would be partly and hesitantly, namely as follows. The joint statement on electronic commerce, as adopted during the 11th Ministerial Conference in Buenos Aires in December 2017, opened the door for fresh negotiations, but so far the WTO member states have not reached consensus on the appropriate classification of goods and services. Discussions about using the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement of 2017 as a potential model are still continuing. In early 2019, 76 WTO member states embarked on new efforts with the attempt of moving towards a so-called digital trade agreement. Work in different councils have been initiated. However, an agreement on key issues and on fundamental regulatory principles appears unlikely to be reached in the future. In contrast, on the level of the preferential trade agreements, certain forward-looking advances can be diagnosed, for example, in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership or the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Since Rodrigo and Franziska are going to address the PTAs, my statement will be very short, namely, regulatory issues of these PTAs of removal of data, bans on data localization, maybe disclosure of source code, really digital assets. So even if the PTA provisions are able to facilitate digital trade in the concerned region, it cannot be overlooked that digital services and not really digital assets in token form on the DLT infrastructure are covered. As a consequence, the legal uncertainties for the DLT business models continue to be an impediment, making the cross-border trade a fragile undertaking. This leads me to the following conclusion. In order to facilitate global trade, the standardization of international trade terms is of utmost importance. Therefore, apart from regulations of states, the standardization should also be promoted by way of private rulemaking. Respective efforts have been undertaken, and reports are showing how different advances can be made in order to make a digital trade regime interoperable in the real world. Hopefully, we can deepen this discussion later during our exchanges. Obviously, the relevant topics for the design of a legally stable environment regarding tokenized assets that go beyond the scope of traditional digital services need to be addressed and tackled. For example, the definition of digital asset, then registry requirements, transfer of digital assets, and liability rules. And finally, based on the assumption that law is a structural system, concrete rule making in the digital world should be developed and should be based on appropriate regulatory principles such as transparency, accountability, robustness, and safety, as well as contribute to the avoidance of distortions caused by anti-competitive behavior or denial of network neutrality. A new digital trade regime encompassing also international regulatory cooperation is needed to overcome the present tensions in WTO law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rolf. If I can hand over to Neha, please.
Yeah, thank you, Iain. And hello, everyone. And big thank you to everyone who tuned in today for our session. And I'm really delighted to be a part of this panel and part of this conference. So the main idea that I want to present today is that trade rules can be compatible with the idea of a globally connected and secure internet. And in that context, I think international trade agreements have an important role to play in the international governance framework of the digital economy, especially with respect to data governance. And some of the points that I will cover have been also partially raised by Rolf. So it shows that there is a convergence of views amongst trade scholars to some extent. So in some of my earlier work, I had argued that when we think of a global framework for digital trade, for the data flows, and we want that to be open and trustworthy, it's very important that we must seek a balance between internet openness, privacy, and security. And of course, there's a technological dimension to it, and a lot of my work's focused on that. But increasingly, there's also a very sensitive and complex political and regulatory dimension to it. And usually when people think about this balance, especially policymakers, they tend to think of it at a domestic level. But our recent experience has shown that that can often backfire because countries often indulge or engage in unilateral policy making, which then is, often fragments the global framework. But on the other side, and this is what I have predominantly argued, is that we can think of a balance between internet openness, privacy, and security at a transnational level. So think of not just from a technological perspective, but also economic perspective. And I think it helps to think of privacy and security as necessary preconditions for a digital trade framework. So in that regard, I would like to highlight, I think, three main ideas as to how I think trade law can facilitate this balance between openness, privacy, and security. The first one, and Rolf briefly mentioned it as well, and I think it's extremely critical, is the implementation of transparency principles. We know that WTO rules, RTAs, contain obligations on transparency, but unfortunately, when it comes to data regulations, we do find that a lot of countries don't have are not transparent, and that is a problem because it leads to reduced trust among countries, and it also increases transaction costs and doesn't lead to very meaningful information sharing between countries. The second idea, again, which I think Rolf, it's a beautiful convergence because he spoke about interoperability. I think about it more in terms of working towards mutual recognition agreements, and this is not a new idea. In fact, if you look at the General Agreement on Trade and Services, Article 7, there is a provision on mutual recognition agreements, and that theoretically could apply, for instance, to data transfer standards or certifications. And of course, now we talk about interoperability. It's a technical idea, and now we apply that idea to also the legal and policy domain. And I'm hopeful that if there are better domestic regulations, more robust domestic regulations in trade agreements, that can support more trust and eventually lead to more mutual recognition agreements in relevant areas of data governance. And finally, the third point that I'd like to highlight, and I think this is most critical for me, is that we need to experiment a little bit more with international regulatory cooperation on digital trade. And I mean this in the broadest possible sense, because a lot of people focus, while it is definitely true that we need to think about how countries can engage with each other at the WTO, and also how different international organizations can work with each other. So the WTO, UNCTAD, World Bank, ITU, WIPO, all these various organizations working on different aspects of digital economy, how they can come together. I think there are two other elements missing in this regulatory cooperation dialogue. One of them is more co-regulatory dialogues, and while that often happens at the not often, sometimes happens at the domestic level, especially when it comes to cybersecurity, standard setting issues, or IoT security, we don't see these dialogues necessarily have that much of an impact at a global level, which I think is very essential because of the very complex and multi-layered nature of the digital economy. And the second thing, which I'm sure Fran will go into more detail, is about the active voice of the civil society bodies and how they might need more avenues, especially on areas where they have expertise, for instance, the internet policy community, or even when you think of civil society bodies and their experience with digital inclusion and empowerment. I think that's, again, another avenue that needs to be opened up more at the WTO and other trade institutions, and but once that can be replicated, those efforts to coordinate to build to coordinate and then build consensus amongst different stakeholders, if that can be replicated more at a transnational level, I think we might see a better, more coherent, more integrated digital trade framework. But let me end with a point of caution. My argument is not that trade institutions should be setting standards or they should become a data governance body, but my argument is that we should find the right role for trade agreements to be more proactive in building a more coherent framework for the digital economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rodrigo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Iain. I just want to add, following up what Neha has just mentioned, where the rules have been made. And if you look at what's happened at the WTO, I mean, as Rolf had described before, not really much, at least up to now. So the rules on e-commerce and digital trade, they have been made worldwide at the international level. They are taking place. They are being they have been established through preferential trade agreements, or regional trade agreements, or free trade agreements, whatever you want to call them. And this is not such a recent story. In fact, if you look at the provisions where where you find the treaties, where you find these provisions, you need to go back almost 20 years to the Jordan-US Free Trade Agreement, and for the first e-commerce provision, then for the first e-commerce chapter, the Australia-Singapore of 2003 FTA, and then you have the first provisions on data flows. They are more specifically on the Korea-US FTA and so on. So you see in recent years an increasing number of agreements. They include more and more e-commerce and digital trade provisions. For the treaties we know, until July this year, you find 128 free trade agreements or preferential trade agreements with e-commerce digital trade provisions, 97 dedicated e-commerce digital trade chapters, 34 of them with general data flows provisions. And you also find some specific data flows provisions in a certain services chapter, not only, for example, on financial services chapter. You have 81 chapters with these provisions, 73 chapters on telecommunications. They also include provisions on data flows. And development you find in PTAs is provisions on data localization. And until July, as I mentioned, you find 24 of them. And the share of these agreements, I mean, if you look at which are the main drivers of these agreements, per region, you will see the region that is signing more of these treaties are the Asia-Pacific Rim countries. So this country seems to be the driving force behind these treaties. And these treaties, they have increased not only the number of provisions, so also the number of words. So the level of detail that is included in these agreements, it gets more and more detailed. Just to give you an example, if we can make like a very general classification of 2 generations of these agreements. Let's say in the first generation of these agreements, the one that started happening 20 years until 10 or 5 years ago even, you have what we can call traditional e-commerce provisions, where the focus is mostly more than digital trade of digital goods, is to sell things through internet. So you have in the same line of thought, you have prohibitions of duties for digital products. You have electronic authentication or mutual recognition of signatures, certificates, the promotion, the facilitation of e-commerce, common provisions on unsolicited commercial electronic messages, spam, and issues about consumer protection, and about also privacy issues. We will discuss later on that how consumer privacy issues are dealt with is a little bit different. But this is what happened in the first generation agreements. In the second generation agreements, you have other type of provisions. To start, you have the very first purely digital trade agreements. So you have the DIPA, the agreement between Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. You have the US, Japan, and you have one between Australia and Singapore. What you have there, you will start having other topics like principles on access on the use of internet, measure to stop partners from forcing companies to localize computing services of data, provisions to prevent forced disclosure of source code, provisions to prevent partners or companies to purchase and utilize local technology. And even most recent agreements, they include provisions on open government data, digital identities, emerging trends and technologies like financial tech, artificial intelligence, and disciplines to regulate digital rulemaking on transparency, right to regulate, public domain, and so on. So to cut a long story short, at the multilateral level, there is no much agreement yet. There is a process that is taking place at the WTO. Let's see what happened there. But rules have been made elsewhere. Whether these rules, they reflect the good rule or not, whether these reflect the national concerns, whether they reflect all the stakeholders, including civil society, is something that is up to discussion, and probably we will discuss this later on in this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Over to you, Franziska.
Thank you. Yeah, just following up there again, rules are made elsewhere. So initially the topic here was what role, or I was advocating for expediting AFCFTA e-commerce negotiations, but that's not required anymore because in the meantime, since February, the EU Assembly has taken a decision to start those negotiations, despite them originally, they should only take place after phase 2 of the AFCFTA negotiation was supposed to end. So they made a decision in February to say, okay, no, we expedite those negotiations now and ending December 2021. I'm not so sure whether that is too ambitious, but so far they were pretty good in keeping to their schedule. So it's interesting now to see what role can that play. And following up from Rodrigo, yes, rules are made elsewhere. So we do know that only 6 African countries are anyway part of the negotiations at multilateral level. There are only 2 agreements, bilateral FTAs with the US, Morocco, and Kenya that actually include digital trade provisions. And that's it. Then you have to look at domestic level, and there's very little in African countries. So there's some stats in terms of percentages, but that relates mostly to a little bit of consumer protection, cybercrime. What I have here is privacy and data protection is very, very prominent in those domestic regulations. But even though those regulations that are in existence, the implementation is extremely incoherent and different from country to country. So you have a problem. And now with, and I do have to say now with COVID, because in Africa, that was a big acceleration of digital solutions, which wasn't there before at all due to the difficulties of the digital infrastructure and all of that. So they were forced into that now, and it will not go back. At least to a certain, to a large extent, it will stay. So that's why they rush now into policies and regulations on domestic level. So that is a big point first to make for what role can it play. So at first it can play a role in providing coherence and more uniform rules and implementation within the African continent, which leads to my first point. So it can actually fast track, so to speak, a continental digital trade area. So now some may wonder, there is no infrastructure anyway, and how do they do that? But if you look at the stats, there is a lot of intra-African trade in electronic transmission. So 70% of everything the most countries, African countries, export on digitizable, if I say that like this, products are intra-Africa. There's also a problem of dominance with South Africa of 46% intra-Africa trade, which has to be addressed. But it is a lot of intra-African trade due to the distance as well within COVID. So you could tap into that potential and now actually create a platform. So that would be the first role it could play. A second very important one could be to consolidate actually the approach, to consolidate a Pan-African position. You will not get everyone to agree to everything, but the issues generally are quite similar. So taking into account that there are 6 countries negotiating on a multilateral level, they can carry that position into those negotiations and representative, you can call it like this, but it can be, it can play a role, but also with regards to the pressure of third countries. There is a pressure of third countries on African countries to negotiate digital trade provisions. And if you have such a position, you kind of can ensure, and I see that I just have 30 seconds, ensure that this is, I tried to make those 4 points quickly, ensure that you then also enter into those negotiations and bilateral agreements like with the US or with more bigger powers with a specific approach, a unified approach. Also, you can use that to develop development-focused integration approach, which is required at the African level. required. And so far as there are two major problems to tackle, which might not be as bad elsewhere, and that is the extreme digital divide as a first point, and the second is the small and medium-sized companies that are the majority in Africa. So and that speaks to the big techs that have to be addressed via competition law, which is a no-go at multilateral level still, but cannot be a no-go at the African level, and maybe that's also a standard setting, and then using it for multilateral negotiations of how it has been done. And to the digital divide, it's not just a digital divide, and I needed to highlight that between Africa and the world, which we know that it is. It's a huge digital divide within Africa. Specifically over the last year, there have emerging platforms, specifically from Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, that dominate. And so this stark divide has created within Africa, but not just between the countries in Africa, also within the countries in Africa.
Well, Fran, I think you've just gone on mute. We've just lost you, I think. Now I can hear you. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I come back to that digital divide and problem on that one has to address it. So just at the last point is that the coherence between the African protocols in the AFCFTA and the potential e-commerce protocol, which I think name-wise is completely off. It should finally be digital trade protocol, but that's a different story to discuss, is that there are cross-cutting issues that are not just part for a digital trade protocol, if you think, but we have a competition protocol, investment IP protocol that are negotiated now or have been just now. So there would be still a chance of now actually having negotiations that you can have a coherent strategy, at least within the African level, that could be then also used as an example. So I leave it there. I have lots more points here, but I'm over the time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Fran. That was great, and you're not very far over the time at all. There was an enormous amount of content in there. Thank you to all the speakers for being reasonably concise and raising some really important issues. We're now going to turn to a more discussion-based part of the session, and the way we've approached this is to divide up the insights that you've introduced in your initial presentations into a series of themes, and I propose that we talk about each of those themes for a few minutes each. We're getting a lot of questions from the audience, which is brilliant. This is obviously a topical discussion. I'm going to try and drop those in as we go, but speakers, if you see a question you want to jump on, feel free to jump on it whenever you have the floor. Interestingly, the first question is requesting the speakers to shed some light on digital platform assets-based versus application-based model business and assets also. And the first theme that we were going to talk about is dealing with digital assets. So maybe, Rolf, you could, we can ask you a couple of questions about your work in the area. One of the things in the paper that you discuss is the issues with classification under the existing WTO frameworks. So a first question to you is, can the classification systems of both the GATT and the GATS be applied to digital assets in times when the lines between goods and services are blurred? And if so, how?
Well, thank you very much for this question. The easy answer would be no. For historical reasons, no, since internet did virtually not exist, and these classifications have been developed, and even less blockchain and distributed ledger technology. And indeed, we do have the problem which I have addressed during my introductory presentation. If I try to be now a little bit more concrete. If we do have a digital asset, a token, then in principle, we also need to have a device, be it a mobile device, a tablet, a computer, and the device obviously is a tangible good for the experts. It's probably the HS number 8523. However, the problem consists in the fact that we would have to find a delineation between, so to speak, the end of the carrier media, which is clear, and the beginning of the digital asset. And this is by far not clear. And speaking as a practitioner, advising clients on DLT business models, we do have a huge legal uncertainty. I'm not digging too much now into the academic discussion. We do have, of course, a lot of voices arguing it should be GATT or it should be GATS respectively. I think the fact that digital assets are not tangible is indeed not a decisive argument, since we do have electricity classified as a good, notwithstanding the fact that electricity is not tangible. So the pure fact of tangibility would be a too formal argument in my opinion, but nevertheless, the problem which I have outlined remains. The classification is not really apt to deal with digital assets.
We can't hear you, Iain.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Thanks very much, Rolf. I don't know if anybody from the panel wants to pick up that issue and comment. If not, I'll make an observation that we probably need some new rules and new approaches here, Rolf. So maybe that brings me to my next question, which is whether private rulemaking by standardization organizations is a reasonable approach for harmonizing trade terms in respect of digital assets.
Well, as I have said during my presentation, in my opinion, we urgently need more standardized terms in digital trade or applying to digital trade, and therefore I was advocating for private rulemaking. And I guess I would go along with Neha's observation that we need a co-regulatory approach in a multi-layer system or a multi-layer situation. We do have reports addressing the respective questions, for example, from the World Economic Forum, report on building value with blockchain technology of 2019, and more recently, report of the OECD 21 on regulatory approaches to tokenization of assets. I think we should not forget about the International Standardization Organization being an organization traditionally dealing with standards issues, and in a co-regulatory approach, I see a certain possibility to implement the multi-stakeholder approach, which is needed to come forward. And perhaps I could also address the platform issue, which has been raised. I think we have to be clear somehow on the scope of WTO or PTA rules. These rules are basically rules agreed upon by governments, by states. If we look at platforms, we don't really have competence of the WTO, at least not a direct competence, to issue rules governing platform behavior. So we have to look for other sources, again, private rulemaking or maybe regional approaches as in the European Union, or obviously we do also have the dynamic coalition on platform regulation in the context of the Internet Governance Forum, developing rules which can be applied to platforms.
Thanks, Rolf. Again, if panelists want to comment, there's an opportunity to do so now. Otherwise, I would, and you could maybe signal me by raising your hand or something like that and waving at me. new platform. If not, I would like your comments, Rolf, on the elements that should be enshrined in the design of a legally stable environment for digital assets. If you could sort of quickly take us through your thoughts on that.
Maybe very shortly, because I think my comments could also build a bridge to Neha's research. We do have somehow globally acknowledged principles governing internet regulations, for example, transparency and accountability. And I think these principles should also be made fruitful in the WTO context very obviously, and we have made the respective experience lately. Safety, robustness and resilience, by the way, also a topic of the OECD, are important in order to realize the potential of digital assets. And I also mentioned avoidance of anti-competitive behavior and avoidance of players denying principle of network neutrality. And finally, and that's now indeed the point, trust and confidence will certainly play an important role for trading digital assets.
Thanks, Rolf. Let me take that bridge that you've provided into Neha's research, and we can maybe turn to our next group of issues around the basic framework for governance of digital trade. Neha, you've talked about some of the key principles that need to be enshrined in your research. And I wonder if you could sort of broaden that a little bit and talk about the options for the frameworks that can be used to implement digital trade rules at the WTO and in regional agreements. How will they shape international governance in the digital economy?
Okay, thank you, Iain. So I think when I think of the possible frameworks, I always have two factors in mind. One is the political dynamic, which is very complex and increasingly very aggressive as well. And the other, if I can say it's aggressive, and the other aspect is just the technology and policy uncertainty and the fact that we don't really know where the digital transformation and digital economy is headed. So when I think of these factors, I think of the best approach, and Rolf already spoke about it in some detail, is to think of a more multi-pronged, a more multi-stakeholder approach, generally for global digital trade governance and specifically also for data governance, which I highlighted more in my presentation. And what this means for me is that trade rules will have they'll have two objectives. One is in terms of setting baseline rules, whether it's in regional trade agreements or more optimistically if it is at the WTO, whether under the JSI, or even better if there could be a multilateral trade agreement in the future. So just setting the baseline rules, and I think the focus of the baseline rules should be one on developing more regulatory coherence to the extent that trade agreements should be doing that, and I'll explain that a little bit later. And the second point I think that is very important is to ensure that we are facilitating digital trust through these rules, because ultimately I think a lot of the aggression we see in the digital tech scenarios because countries don't trust each other. The other aspect that I think, or the other role of trade agreements, and this is more of a network role as a network agent, would be to address and to respond to some of the other developments in different fora. And this is not necessarily trade fora. It could be the Internet Governance Forum, it could be private standard setting organizations, it could be multi-stakeholder internet policy bodies, and it could be across a large number of issues: data protection, cybersecurity, disinformation, censorship, online IP, consumer protection. So all the evolving transnational consensus, the norms, and a lot of them will be soft law norms in my assessment, that would have an influence in trade agreements. And it would be good to see that trade agreements acknowledge them and incorporate them by reference as necessary, so they don't necessarily prescribe specific standards, but they incorporate the relevant standards by reference, and also avoid hard obligations in areas where differences between countries cannot be reconciled, whether it's due to different ideologies or also, as Fran said, because of different development trajectories. So I think that would be the optimal framework, a very multi-layered framework with trade agreements playing a baseline role, but also responding and acting with the rest of the larger big picture of the multi-layered framework.
Interesting. Any comments from the panel? Rodrigo, no?
No, I mean, just when you talk about regulatory coherence or regulatory convergence, and one should ask what would be the rule that we will all converge, and then that I think is very important to analyze who is making the rule, if it's that rule, but that and all agree on converge in a very bad rule. That I'm not sure that there is a positive side of that.
Yeah. And I think, Rodrigo, just if I could respond to Rodrigo, when I say regulatory convergence, I don't necessarily mean regulatory harmonization, actually. I think I'm more in line with what Rolf was suggesting of interoperable frameworks. I do acknowledge, and in fact, I think it is not, at this point, not even desirable to have a harmonized framework in many areas of digital and data regulation, if not all. I mean, it would be good if all countries agreed upon the gold standard in data protection. But we know even when countries converge on high-level principles, their individual frameworks can have very different kinds of rules because of culture or regulatory capacity or political reasons. So yeah, I definitely don't mean regulatory convergence in the sense of harmonization, but in the sense of more of the interoperability that Rolf was talking about. And I think one of the questions in the chat also was whether there should be a country that is should be taken as a model of regulatory convergence. I'm sorry, I can't remember who asked this question, but they wanted to know if Singapore is the right example. And I would say yes and no. I mean, Singapore is a very small, advanced digital economy. They can open up, and what Singapore would want to do would be very different from what South Africa might want to do, because the nature of economies are very different. So we have to acknowledge these differences, and that's why I ended with the caution that let's not get into very hard obligations which will not accommodate different asymmetries in the system. It's important we address that. Yeah.
Thanks. Neha, you just touched on interoperability amongst other things, and I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the options for developing interoperability in the digital economy.
Yeah. I think let me just focus on this question from the perspective of trade agreements. So one is, I think, and this I think is more of a idealistic notion, but I think it's possible that, especially at the WTO, because it is a body with such worldwide membership, it's possible to have more exchange of information, knowledge sharing, technical capacity building on different aspects of digital regulation, because from my observations, from whatever I have been able to observe at the WTO in different contexts, has been that many countries, especially developing countries and LDCs, don't often understand what's going on. So WTO as a multilateral, the only multilateral trade organization, has an important role to build that kind of consensus. And I would hope that they would be more open to more stakeholders joining and understand that trade negotiations are often secretive, but not all aspects of trade policy making need to be secretive. And I think the other thing, and Thomas Trines also had a question on those lines, would be about how trade rules can respond to multi-stakeholder norms, private standards, or co-regulatory mechanisms. And I mean, I think it'll be something interesting to see, because this is a different form of regulation from multilateral trade regulation, but it's not impossible that trade agreements eventually start acknowledging that there are private standards and multi-stakeholder standards that can be relevant. And Thomas asked about food standards. So I think both TBT and SPS are good examples. And in fact, in some of my work in a different piece, I had argued that the TBT Code of Good Conduct would be a very good starting point to think about standard setting, especially for digital services, because there are no rules within the GATS framework. So yeah, I think these are the two options for interoperability within the trade framework.
Thanks for that, Neha. Others can comment when they have the floor, but I just wanted to move forward, and I wondered if you could really quickly comment on one of my favourite questions in any kind of international trade discussion, which is what should be the balance between obligations and exceptions in international trade to balance internet policy concerns. And you might talk about, the domestic policy side as well, if you wish.
Yeah. So yeah, the exceptions are very important. And it's a good guess that any country that wants to protect their regulatory space will look at the wording of the exceptions. A lot is hanging on the interpretation of the exceptions, and it's not surprising that there's so many wide debates as to how the GATT general exceptions and security exceptions apply. What about the CPTPP exceptions and now the RCEP exceptions? Because all of them have different wording, so the implications are regulatory. But so while definitely this question of interpretation, I think there's also a question of perception, because I think even if you have really well-worded flexible exceptions, if you are in a politically charged environment, then countries don't feel safe even when there are exceptions in trade agreements. And that's the reason why I think in RCEP, for instance, you see more the trend towards much broader exceptions for cybersecurity or generally for data localization, and similarly for privacy in many of the EU FTAs. The other thing about exceptions that I'll quickly point out is to just reflect on whether they are, the way they exist, whether they are relevant for the digital world, especially like just one example, if you think of the security exception and if you think of cyber wars and cyber threats, there are really many questions regarding whether these exceptions really, does it cover a cyber war, or what about latent cyber threats? Are we eternally in a state of cyber war? So can any country invoke a security exception at any point of time? So all this, of course, points to the need for a more flexible balance, and reading existing exceptions in an evolutionary manner is one way to go, but I don't think in a politically charged environment that provides sufficient comfort to all the countries at the WTO and elsewhere.
Very, very interesting. Rolf, I think you might have had a comment on Neha's points.
Well, only a very short comment. We do have, of course, the exception rules in GATT and GATS. And what we see, and that's perhaps not a development which is very desirable, is quite a substantial broadening of the exception provisions lately. If you talk about security or cyber security, all of a sudden, national interests in certain areas are becoming security issues, and that is probably a trend going in the wrong direction. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. We could keep talking about this issue, but in the spirit of moving forward and hearing from everybody, let's now turn to another set of questions around what we actually see in existing trade agreements. Rodrigo, I wonder if you could just give us a quick rundown on the main characteristics of the evolution of digital trade provisions and preferential trade agreements.
Yeah, thank you very much, Iain. I will try to connect it with some of the questions on the chat on this. I think that, for example, in the beginning, the first generation agreements, they were taking a big deal of referring to some WTO principles. And actually, as Michelle is asking if there was a discussion about trading services or for trading goods, actually there were in the first generation agreements a number of footnotes. It was saying that the regulation of e-commerce does not amount to any final conclusion if it is whether it's trading goods or this is trading services. So it was regulated like something like sui generis, but always referring somehow to a general WTO framework. And you find less and less references to WTO when it comes to the regulation of e-commerce. And in fact, the language has changed more. So now you have chapters that they call themselves digital trade chapters than e-commerce chapters. And so one of the, I would say that the main characteristic of this evolution of preferential trade agreements is that first they start acknowledging what there is and what there isn't at WTO, with the discussion on the no charge, no the the moratorium on tariffs and the principles of WTO, and then they move to WTO X or WTO plus provisions that they are not included in these agreements. Not only one of the things that has been included recently, there are issues on data localization and data flows. And some of the people have been asking in the chat if is whether there is actually one good rule that it could be used on this to take it to the multilateral level. And I'm afraid that there is not. That what you have is that a group of countries that they seem to believe that data flows or the guarantee of free flow of data is fundamental for these agreements, and other countries that are reluctant to accept that, and they have done so in fewer, but at least in some trade agreements. So that's another tendency. You see some split. Probably the most important split I see is when it comes to the issues of this free flow of data and data localization on one hand, that they tend to have binding provisions on preferential trade agreements, and the issue of consumer protection and privacy. So you have a number of preferential trade agreements with rules on consumer protection and on data privacy. But if you look at the provisions, they are largely non-binding. They are best efforts provisions, or they have, in some kinds, some binding commitments, but the large majority are non-binding, whereas when it comes to data flows, the agreements, they have binding provisions. And here is something that we need to take into account, is that there's also, was mentioned by one person in the chat, Kimani, I think, that there is also an important gap between the international commitments and what actually countries do domestically. So one thing is what they commit internationally to do, and a different picture is what they do at the national level. And I think maybe we can discuss this later on what happened with this disconnect between, for example, the commitments they undertake on the regulation of data flows, and then what they want to do with domestically. And I see potential for some problems in some countries that actually have changed the vision they had on these issues, and now they have some kind of international commitment saying something different that they want to do domestically.
That's really interesting, Rodrigo. Any comments from the panel on those observations?
Well, just one comment, because Rodrigo said that there has been not much on the domestic level. I think that is one concern that some developing countries also have with regards to when you look at previous experiences. TRIPS is one big example where there was encouragement and commitment. It wasn't a real binding obligation in the TRIPS, but there was an encouragement to technology transfer. The mere fact that TRIPS's existence is based on the understanding that there will be technology transfer, which is here in this case really required, and we know very well that it hasn't happened. It's absent. We don't have to actually go even into the discussion of the TRIPS waiver, where that is now raised in terms of technology transfer, but generally technology. So I just wanted to add that also that commitment, that's on not just a recent thing, that is a ongoing story with the WTO, depending on the interest and on the country and issue.
I think introducing the experience with TRIPS is a really interesting angle on this discussion. It's something that occurred to me as I was reading Rolf's research, which talked about the inadequacies of the GATT and GATS classification systems to deal with some of the challenges, particularly with digital assets. But it struck me that digital assets are not unlike intellectual property in the sense that they're related to trade. There's a trade-related dimension to it, but they're not actually goods or services, the traditional kind of transactional core of trade. I'm going to throw that in as a comment. I think we should move forward because we have limited time for the panel, and I want to move through things. Rodrigo, you actually addressed a few of the other points that I think I was going to raise as we go through, but I just wonder if you want to add any other comments. Actually, this picks up on a point that Neha addressed from the floor, which is, you know, the countries that have been the main drivers of the provisions in digital chapters of RTAs. And actually, if you could sort of put that together with maybe some comments on the emerging trends that we see in recent trade agreements.
Well, if you look at the countries that have concluded more of these agreements, I mean, the impression you would have, I mean, would be normally there would be some rule makers trying to replicate their model, and you would think naturally maybe in the US. But if you take on the number of treaties that have been concluded, you will see that yes, there is an important US footprint, let's say, on these trade agreements. But there is a very important also footprint of participation of what I mentioned, Asia-Pacific Rim countries, and here I'm notably I'm talking about Singapore. I'm talking about some Latin American countries, including in Chile. I'm talking about Japan. They have a say of they have certain provisions they have not necessarily included in let's say American preferential trade agreements with digital trade provisions. One very good example is that the DIPA agreement, that is probably the most detailed agreement we have now with new trends, as I mentioned, on digital identities and so on. It was concluded by 3 Asia-Pacific Rim countries. And one may wonder why these 3 countries want to conclude. I think Neha will address this in another webinar next week. Why these countries that they are not big, they don't have big industries on digital industries. They are doing this, but they want to stop being rule takers and become rule makers. Having seen that the countries that come first to this type of agreements, they are the ones that they were starting shaping up the rules of the game. So maybe that's a very a question that should be researched more upon. But on the main drivers, then where as mentioned, I see the possibility of some conflict with this disconnect between what happened with national laws. So of course there is for example, let's go to privacy. The Latin American countries, they are part of, let's say, the Pacific Alliance countries, so Colombia, Peru, Mexico, Chile. They have concluded a number of preferential trade agreements with digital trade provisions that they basically enshrine this principle of free data flow. And not is never absolute, it's always for the services that have been provided on, but the principle is free data flow. And with very, as I mentioned, very non-binding or best effort protection on data privacy. And then you have in these countries now a discussion about adopting a model of privacy protection similar to the European GDPR, or they want to attempt to become adequate for European standards because many of them they are not. And the question is, in the goal of becoming adequate to data protection under European standards, it could be a disconnect with this data flows commitments they have already included in preferential trade agreements. It's not really clear that they will be fully compatible, and that could be a problem. So I think that it's something that it needs to be really examined, especially for countries that, as Franziska was mentioning, that are completely out of the game now, out of the discussion, most African countries, that this is a problem they can face of not connecting international commitments with domestic implementation.
Cool, thanks. Well, let's move on with another series of questions. Moving from the PTA environment towards a more global multilateral, plurilateral approach. Rodrigo, could you just start us off? I think you mentioned some points about this earlier, but I'd be interested in your thoughts in terms of what kinds of provisions that you've seen in PTAs what kind of provisions could actually be picked up at a multilateral or plurilateral level?
Well, I think that the easy ones, I mean, I don't think there would be any discussion that spam is bad, okay? So countries, they could easily agree that unsolicited commercial electronic messages, they should be regulated or prohibited and so on. And also there has been almost a consensus, but that consensus is not really, I would say, is, I think it's soon to be over, about the prohibition of duties for digital products. It has been every year has been reiterated. I'm not sure if it's going to happen for such a long time. But there are other things that are low-hanging fruit, like electronic authentication, the facilitation or reduction of unnecessary barriers to e-commerce, non-discrimination issues, the facilitation of the use of by SMEs, so issues on cybersecurity. I think that they will easily, probably easily agree. But then you come to the complicated stuff, like protection of privacy, digital identities, how much information you want your government to have, because up to now, all these agreements, the discussion is on the point of view that, Thomas is telling me not everybody agree what spam is. I completely agree. But the principle that unsolicited messages, they are not, probably they will agree on something there. I think that it would be very difficult they will agree on something on privacy anytime soon. And I just wanted to say that most of the evolution in trade agreements is focused on the idea that the data, especially the discussion on data flow, the data is managed by private companies. But it is very little, but although there are some, that they apply the same disciplines to, or the same restrictions to the data that is managed by government. And I think that's another discussion we are not having on trade agreements yet, on how much of this, how much the governments can do with data flows. And there are some trade agreements that include provisions on this, but very few. And yes, and other emerging issues that I don't see that there is enough there to have a multilateral understanding on this. For example, on financial tech or artificial intelligence, I think it's going to be difficult.
Well, Fran, maybe I can turn to you now. I mean, maybe in light of those points that Rodrigo's just made, and also maybe in light of your earlier comments about the divide in Africa in particular at the moment, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how the results of plurilateral negotiations can be incorporated into the WTO legal framework. Equally, you could approach that question, I guess, as a more narrow legal question, a more technical question. In your hands.
So the results on multilateral, I will say something to, may I just address something
Please.
Rodrigo said just now first, and that relates to the results of data and who's the ownership and that, because it's a really big issue specifically. I mean, we all know that India as well, but also African countries have a completely different view on that. They fight for the fact to actually have data localization requirements and source codes for very specific reasons. And I think that would be an issue which will not be agreed upon on multilateral level for a while. So the reasons why they want that is that for owning those data and using them for themselves. So I know it's a no-go on multilateral level, because there is in a lot of PTAs there is a ban on those requirements already in, and also on the source codes. But why are they using it, and why would they like that? Is there are taxation issues. Taxation is a core issue for developing countries. Sometimes the only source it was in the past of revenue. So that falls apart with the change of trade environment, so you have less to put customs on. So now you have to change your thinking. So how can you use that? And you try now to tax those changed goods or changed services, and it's still your almost only source of revenue. If you look at South Africa, there's so less tax from income tax because the unemployment rate is so high. So we always just lost because there's so little people who actually. So you have very, very few income streams. So for them, taxation is a real big point, but you can only do that with some data localization or source requirements. So that is a very complicated issue also for the purpose. That will not be resolved on multilateral level very soon. So that you could consider, and I'm going there also to Thomas' question earlier in the chat, where he asked, how do we address those two things, digital divide and the big tech? And I know I start now from later, but I think that's our pressing questions. You could maybe find compromises over special and differential treatment. You have seen that in the CPTP, where I think Vietnam has given a transitional period of not having to apply data localization requirements and so on. I'm not sure whether they would agree to that, because at one point the transition period is over, and then they would have to. So then the question starts again: how long, and those kind of things. But we have seen it in some Asian PTAs where they actually accommodated those different speeds with SNDT requirements. I think also in the US-Mexico agreement for Mexico, there was some transition periods. So you can use SNDT for accommodating different speed. Yes, we come then back to the discussion of who is developed. Now, we have that in the recent debate of reform. You have China as a market economy. We all don't agree anymore that they're really developed in some areas and so on. So you would have to have this discussion as well of who is digitally developed. And maybe you then even start a discussion of you can be developed in one sector and not in another. Because I think that is maybe a conducive approach. Yeah. So South Africa is not developed in the mining sector. They are the leaders in that sector. So you cannot say they are a developing country, but they are certainly when it comes to health issues or and also digital trade. So maybe that's also revitalize these discussions as well. One more point to Thomas's question with regards to what to do to reduce the digital divide. I think competition law is key. I know it's Christina said something in the chat to that OECD work on it with regards to investment. I agree, but they also did a lot of work already on competition. And why is it a no-go on the WTO level? It's one of the biggest contributors to inequality to not have multilateral rules on competition, in my view. Because you do reduce trade barriers for states. You eliminate them and try to reduce them as much as you can, and they're replaced by private economic actor behavior. And it's not disciplined. They can do whatever they want, and it's just disciplined if you have, in fact, a regional or domestic competition law. And that's not in small economies that have other issues to deal with, that have to implement TRIPS standards, that have to implement, they don't even have intellectual property, they protect them for others, but they have other issues to pay for. They're not having competition law on their agenda. So there are a lot of things that can be done, and a lot of things that already in the current system shows us that are inherently tending towards inequality. And you can just take them and analyze them and see that's what happened there. So we can now do it with a digital trade, maybe different. So I know, but there were so many questions and discussions. So it's kind of like, I think, piled up on my side now.
That's great, Fran. I'm actually I'm just going to say that I'm actually less interested, I think, in the question of the relationship between plurilateral relations and WTO. This kind of stuff is much more interesting. And in fact, let's just carry on into some of those questions about different countries' interests. There's several things I'd like you to comment on, Fran. We have about 7 or 8 minutes left in our session, and I wouldn't mind leaving 30 seconds for final words from everybody. But I'd be really interested in your views on the rationales for South Africa and India to oppose WTO negotiations on digital trade. I'd also be quite interested in your views on how the digital gap can be accommodated or reduced. Do you want to pick up those points and talking about balancing different countries' interests in these things?
So, as I said now, I think to reduce the gap, competition would play a major role. because that is the major concern. It's small and medium-sized companies that are scared of being overrun by big techs. So you can do that, of course, in different ways. We can discuss how to kind of like discipline those players, but you can. And that's why one of the biggest thing is, earlier in the chat, we said it's not a core IEL issue. Well, no, it wasn't addressed, but it is in fact, because it does play into trade and has an extreme linkage to how you displace specific players. And just a note on that at national level for states, it is a matter of course to have competition law. So it wonders why it is not on a multilateral level where the same kind of market strength and the economy plays. So that's one thing. Another thing is also to give policy space for those who need to establish a little bit like an infant industry logic. I know that's not the best way in economics, but if you think of what is needed, because we're not speaking just about digital trade, we're speaking also about things like artificial intelligence and smart applications and all those things that might have also an ethical impairment. So we do have to think about how to include those to reduce the digital gap. I saw there from the comment on taxation. Yeah, it will be difficult. I do fully agree, but I think if you at least try to get some service transmissions text in a way, then you can, we don't know. The digital service tax is in France, I think, was the first one who actually successfully did it. But there are ways of doing it, and maybe we can just not give up on it. At least when I heard yesterday the panel on the minimum tax, that was, there are ideas. There are IP issues to address. The TRIPS system in itself, as it is inherently leading to inequality. So I think what I'm saying is that there are a lot of pinpoints in the current international economic government system that we have. We know we had that with agricultural subsidies. We know that a lot of areas are turned out to be tending towards more inequality. So why not listing them and looking at them? Where is it affecting small market players the most, and address them at least to a specific point? Because if we start just doing it the same way, trade liberalization with a couple of exceptions, then we will have the same thing. And maybe that is an opportune time to actually think about what happened in the first time. And we start again on a back footing. And I say we as an African country because that's where I'm sitting now. But they are already on the back footing, and it's their fault to a certain degree because of development issues. And you can do that, you can say that, but yeah, that where does it start? Sorry.
So Fran, I mean, you've talked about a number of elements. I mean, are these all elements that, and you've also talked about the African context. I wonder if these are elements that you think should be enshrined in the what is it, the currently being negotiated protocol on e-commerce and the African continental FTA discussions?
Because there is a dominance problem as well. So South Africa will be dominant, Nigeria will be dominant, and Kenya. So you have the players, and you need exactly those. And that's why I'm saying it could be a standard and maybe a test of how it works. Because otherwise you will have the same problem what we criticize at the multilateral level within the continent. So yes, that's exactly it. Different speeds. Competition rules on the African continent are tested long time. So we have a lot of regional competition rules that actually do that already and are enshrined in the FTAs. So that is not a new thing. It's alien to the WTO, but not to the regional level at all. And they needed that because they needed to prevent these dominant market players, at least to a certain extent. It wasn't always successful, but at least they have the rules and tools to do so, specifically South Africa and Kenya.
Thank you very much. I'm really reluctant to cut off the discussion, but we're nearing our end time. In fact, I think we've got 1 minute left, but we'll take the liberty of maybe giving ourselves a couple of minutes extra. Fascinating discussion. We've only scratched the surface, I think, of the issues, but I wonder if I could get final, very quick 30 seconds, final quick words from each speaker, either commenting on a really important point that's emerged from the discussion, or giving your key takeaway from the session. I was going to ask Fran first, but Fran, if you would like to take a few moments to collect your thoughts, you've just been speaking a bit. I can go to Rodrigo and then come back to you at the end. Fran, over to you.
Fine. I see just also so many questions in the chat. I will note them and then maybe in private reply. I do think that it's a pity that African countries are not part of the negotiations at multilateral level, because it is important to hear their voices, but there are very clear reasons why not so. And I hope that those that are part carry those ideas that are negotiated on an African level into those negotiations in a very strong way. That would be my final word, because there are issues that do concern African countries, but also other developing countries, small island states, and so on. So I would be, that's my final word. Thanks.
Rodrigo.
I just want to say that many of us are focusing, maybe with a good reason, on what's happening at WTO. My only comment would be that you need to also look what's happening outside the WTO. And there is a lot happening outside the WTO on digital trade. And probably if something is agreed at WTO, what has been agreed outside the WTO will serve as a very good basis to the discussion or to the agreement.
Thanks. Neha.
Well, my final takeaway always, whenever I come to such sessions, is that everything is connected to everything. So I think my final take is we should proceed with optimism, but also with caution, and make sure that trade agreements serve their role within the capacity in which they can. But also, as Rodrigo and Fran also spoke, we should look at what is happening outside of the WTO and outside of the trade world to make sure that we have a better framework and a more inclusive framework for the digital economy.
Thank you. And Rolf.
Thank you very much. I would prefer not to summarize our discussion and not reply to a specific question, but even broader the perception of outside of the WTO. We were talking about digital trade and mainly looked at trade regimes. However, we shouldn't forget that with digital assets, we are coming very close to financial market law. If we have tokenized diamonds from South Africa, we do not only have the problem of trade rules, but also of financial rules. And in this field, a lot of things are going on, starting from the Bank of International Settlements with the central bank digital currencies, to the FATF in Paris with all the anti-money laundering rules, which would in fact also be applicable on the tokenized South African diamonds. So indeed, it's the opening of a Pandora box, but I think we have to take this approach.
Thanks, Rolf. I think the opening of a Pandora's box is a really great way to end our session. Let me bring everything to a conclusion by saying that I hope everybody in the audience enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Neha, Franziska, Rodrigo, and Rolf, thank you so much for your insights today. With that, let me close the session by wishing everybody good health and all the best for the rest of the conference. Thanks to everybody, and goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.